Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Advanced EDI, Reading X12 for the 999 and 277 CA. Before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items. If you are on the line and have not yet connected to the webinar, click the link in your reminder email. When you are connected, you should see the first presentation slide. If you have questions, you can send your question via chat. Please take a moment to find the chat bubble icon near the bottom and center of the webinar screen. You can type and send questions throughout the presentation. We will compile them and take time to answer them at the end. As a reminder, although we will review a little basic information, the bulk of this webinar will be a deep dive into the logic behind the 999 and 277 CA reports. If you missed last month's Advanced EDI course, which included more general X12 information, you may want to watch the video of that webinar and then review the content from today. Today's webinar is being recorded, and links to both Advanced EDI webinars will be distributed to all registered attendees after the event. Now I'm going to turn the time over to the very capable Sarah, and it's time to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. All right, let's go ahead and get started, you guys. We've got a lot to go over, and I'm really excited that we finally get to do a deep dive course on this. Let me give you an idea of what we're going to be going over. As Chris had mentioned, we are going to be doing a brief review of a couple of bits of terminology, really, is what they're going to be. It is going to be pretty brief so that we can spend the bulk of our time on the other two items. Inside each of the deep dives, you'll see I've also got a test run listed. If you were in last month's webinar, it's going to be a pretty similar kind of structure. I'm going to give you some examples of raw data, and we're going to practice some of the concepts that we've learned a little bit earlier. It's just in this case, we're going to go a couple layers deeper than we did before. Let's jump into these critical terms. The first one is called nesting. This is something we're going to lean on a lot, especially in the 999 transaction. If you look on the right, you'll see that at the top and the bottom of this envelope section, we've got this ISA and an IEA at the bottom, and between the two of them, they bracket everything else. This is what's called a header and a footer. So there's going to be something at the top and something at the bottom defining the beginning and ending of a transaction so that somebody knows that they've got the whole thing. Inside of that, we have GS and GE. And again, the GS is the header and the GE is the footer. That's the beginning and the end of a particular grouping of data. Inside of GS and GE segments, we get ST and SEs. And ST and SEs, again, there's a header, there's a footer. Footers can also be called trailers, by the way. And they are defining the beginning and the end of certain segments and groupings of information. Now, the reason I have this symbol here to the left is because I really like the example of Russian nesting dolls. It is very much the same kind of idea. So if we were to apply this envelope stuff over here to the nesting dolls, which if you're not familiar with them, they are hollow dolls where the smallest ones fit inside the larger ones. So if we look at the smallest doll, that would be our ST to SE. And inside an ST to SE is where you'll find what I call the payload of the transaction. This is the information that you want to communicate out to the destination. So there's a top half and a bottom half to the doll that kind of match together, and that's the ST and the SE. That whole thing fits inside the next larger doll. That would be our GS and GE, which again has both a top and a bottom that will completely surround and encapsulate the ST, the SE, and everything inside of that. And then the middle-sized doll will fit in the largest doll, which is the ISA and the IEA. There is nesting occurring in places other than the envelope, but this is just one visual that will kind of illustrate the concept. The other thing I want to talk about is something called a hierarchical level. Now, the information in this screen was actually covered in the last webinar. We went over loops, segments, and elements as different ways of grouping and categorizing data so that it's easy to find when you're looking for something specific. Now, there is a grouping of data larger than the loop. If you have multiple loops that are related, they will come together and they will form a hierarchical level. Hierarchical levels are going to be extremely important when we get to the 277CA. So just remember, hierarchical level includes multiple loops, and then inside of the loops, you get your segments and your data elements. All right, the very brief overview having been done, let's jump into the deep dive with the 999. The 999 is a functional or implementation acknowledgement, and if you look at the purpose bubble there on the left, you'll see that it reports syntax and implementation errors for the functional group. Now, there's a couple things I want to say about this. Syntax and implementation errors are all about, is the transaction formed correctly? Does it have the right pieces? Are the pieces in the right order? Does the claim have any invalid characters? Things like that would be considered syntax and implementation related. The other thing I want to point out is this functional group business. And I'm going to draw a connection here. Anytime you see functional group, I want you to know that that is referring to a GS to GE. So GS and GE equals functional group. That is something we're going to lean on quite a bit as we get further in. In the characteristics bubble, we'll see that 999s are typically returned within 24 hours. That is when 999s are returned. It's not a required transaction, and so payers are not necessarily going to always send it. However, if you do get one, they're actually usually more within minutes to hours. 24 hours is just the outside reasonable time limit for that. 999s are also typically at the batch level. What this means is that if you were to send a batch of claims that had 10 claims inside of it, the 999 response indicating an acceptance or a rejection would be indicating that all 10 were accepted or all 10 were rejected. So that's what I mean by a batch level response. It usually doesn't designate or distinguish between the claims or the smaller bits of transactions inside the batch. Now, there are some payers who have structured things in a way that allows them to send rejections on the claim level. And I'll show you how to recognize this in a 999, but just so you know, that is actually not the expected or the standard implementation of a 999 in the industry. So I would set your expectation that any acceptances or rejections are on the batch level, and then if it happens to be at the claim level, well, that's just a happy surprise. On the right bubble there, I have version, and I just put this here for two reasons. One is that if you need an implementation guide and you do not yet have one for this transaction, this is the version number you're going to want to be looking for. And then if you look inside of every transaction, the GS segment is going to have the version number for that transaction. So as we get into the examples, if you want to take a quick look at the GS, you'll see this version number in there. What I've got here is a look at the 999 hierarchy, or the way that it's put together. It's a pretty simple transaction, all things considered. So I've only got 3 layers here, and some of these layers are even situational. Not all of them will be there all of the time. I also want to point out that all of these layers are inside of the transaction header and footer. So the ISA, IEA, GS, GE, ST, ST, all of that is on the top and the bottom of these layers. So like other X12 transactions, this one starts more general up at the top, and it gets more specific the further down and in we go. The first layer up there is the functional group response. Now remember, I'm drawing a connection between functional group and GS to GE. So what this is saying is that this is a response to a specific GS to GE section of the original transaction. Underneath that, we get a transaction set response. This is where I'm going to draw another connection that we're going to refer back to. Transaction set is referring to an ST to SE. And that is, again, something that it's going to be repeating as we go. So just remember, transaction set corresponds to an ST to SE. So this particular response, which is situational, by the way, we'll go to more of that later, but if you do get it, it's giving you a response for a specific ST to SE from the original transaction. And remember, there can be multiple ST to SEs, so this can be a very useful area. Inside the transaction set response, we have some error information. This one is definitely going to be situational because, well, hopefully you're not getting error information on an accepted 999. These, again, though, within the error information, we're going to go more general up at the top to more specific further down. We start with loop and segment level error information, and then we go down into the data element stuff. Now let's take a look at that in the context of a 999. This is an example 999, but it's put together the same way. If you look up there, we've got ISA, IEA, GSGE, all of these header and footer stuff bracketing the inner portion, which is the layering that we just looked at in the previous slide. So if we look at these, we'll see that the functional group, it has both a header and a footer. The header is going to be the AK1. Now, if you follow the color coding around and down, the footer is the AK9. So the AK1 is the beginning, the AK9 is the end of the functional group response. The transaction set response, and it looks like the letters got a little bit out of order there, but the transaction set response does begin with the AK2, and then it also has a footer. So if you follow that around and down, you'll see the IK5 is the footer. So again, AK2 is the beginning, IK5 is the end of the same transaction set response. Nested inside of that is the error information. Loop and segment information is up at the top. Data element is just a little further down. So let's go through these in order. Now, I am going to be going kind of fast, but just so you know, I'm going to be sending the slides after the presentation as well. So if there's a particular element that you need to refer back to, you will have a resource for that. We're going to start with the functional group and the transaction set response. So even though one is for the functional group, one is for the transaction set, they are very similar in how they function and how they're structured. So we're going to cover them together. And in fact, we're going to cover them as headers and then as footers. So we'll do that in two separate sections. The headers for both are all about reporting original transaction type and an ID to identify which original transaction is being referenced. The footers for both of them are about reporting the status. Was it accepted or was it rejected? As far as workflow goes, I'm always a fan of finding the status first because that'll let me know how much detail I need to be looking for in my other steps. So we're going to start with the IK5 and the AK9. The IK5 is the transaction set response trailer. So remember, transaction set is an ST to SE, and it's a very short segment, as you can see. The IK501 position is the acknowledgement code. This is the one that's actually telling us whether it was accepted or rejected. The R in this case means rejected. The IK502 is a syntax error code. Now, syntax error codes are just going to give a little additional information about what's going on, and all of these codes and their definitions will be included in the implementation guide. In fact, let me show you a screenshot. These are the two positions that we just saw on the previous screen. On the left is the IK501 with the acknowledgement code, and if you look in there, I don't know if you can see it, but we've got A for accepted, E accepted but errors were noted. There's an R for rejected in there. There's also an M, a W, and an X, but those are less commonly used. So I would focus mainly on the A, the E, and the R. In the IK502 on the right, these are the syntax error codes. And they have things like transaction set not supported, one or more segments in error, unknown security recipient. So again, it's just giving a little additional information as to what happened. This is situational, so this will mostly show up if the acknowledgement code was an R for rejection. The AK9, very similarly, is going to be the functional group response trailer. So it's still showing us the response, it's just for the GS to GE. Like the IK5, we have an acknowledgement code in the first position. Again, this one is an R. Usually these are going to match the IK5. I haven't ever seen them be different. Theoretically, it should be possible, though. Now, because we're on the functional group level, remember there can be many ST to SEs within a single GS to GE. So the rest of this segment gives us a little view of how many of these ST to SEs are involved. The AK902 position is the number of transaction sets included in this response. Third position is the number of received transaction sets. And the fourth position is the number that were accepted. So because we're at the GS to GE, we can get a little bit of an overview of how much of the original transaction is being talked about in this particular rejection. Okay, so here we are. We just looked at the trailer. Now let's take a look at the headers, which again, for both of them, they're all about the original transaction type and an ID. The AK1 is the functional group response header. So again, GS to GE, we're looking at that level here. And the first position in here is going to actually be the value from the original transaction's GS01 position. This is a code, and this particular code actually means healthcare claim. There's a lot of different codes, though. There's HI for healthcare services review information. There's PI for patient information. A lot of different options here. And this is where I want to point out that a lot of times we get very focused on how 999s can be used to respond to 837s, but 999s can be responses to pretty much any type of transaction. So you may see 999s that have an HB instead of an HC, indicating it's responding to an eligibility request. So again, a lot of different ways that the 999 can be used. In the AK102 position, this is going to be a control number or tracking number from the original file, specifically the one in the GS06 position. So this is going to be a way that you can match this back to whichever GS to GE has been, in my example here, rejected. In the third position, I get the original transaction version. Now, I knew from the HC that this was a healthcare claim, but the version will tell me if it was a dental claim, if it was professional, if it was institutional. The AK2 is very, very similar. It is just for the transaction set, so ST to SE, but it's also situational. The AK2 is required to be present when there's an error, but if there's no error, then it's really up to the sender whether they include it or not. So you may see this on accepted 999s, or you may not. If you do see it, the three positions there are very, very similar to the AK1. The first is the transaction type and error, and instead of telling us HC, this one just tells me 837. I still get about the same level of detail there. In the second position, I've got the value from the original transaction's ST02. So this is, again, a control number or a tracking number. And then in the third position, I get the original transaction version again. Okay, so we just went over the functional group and transaction set responses with both the header and the footer. Let's now go over the error information that was nested inside of that. We're going to start, we're going to go from top to bottom on there, but we're going to handle all of them as a group, because as a group, they're all about identifying the location of the error and the type of error. So we'll just go in order, IK3, CTX, IK4, and look at that, there's another CTX. We'll go over what that's all about in a minute. The IK3 is error identification, and this one, it is situational, but if there's an error present, you will get this one. So this is very consistent and a good one to look for. In the first position of this IK3, we're going to get the segment in error. So in my case, I know that my error happened in a DTP or date time period segment. The second position is going to be it's basically a segment count. Now, segment counts always begin from the ST, and they include the ST. So if I were to line up all of the segments in my original transaction and just count starting from the ST, 1, 2, 3, 4, when I get to 22, per my example there, I should be at the DTP segment that was in error. So if you have multiple DTP segments in a file, which is quite possible, this is one way that you can tell which one it is. Another way is you can look at the third position, which is the loop in error. In my case, it's the 2300. It narrows it down a little bit, but there still are multiple DTPs in the 2300 loop, so it's a good thing I have that segment count. And then fourth, we have the syntax error code. Again, syntax error codes will be listed in the implementation guide with their explanations. After the IK3, we get a CTX. CTX segments are context segments, and they're actually fairly multi-purpose, which is why you'll get more than one. This particular one is situational. It's a business unit identifier, and this one is required if the error is within a business unit and the unit is known. Now, the key with a CTX segment is to look at the first position, because the first position is your context identification. It'll tell you something about what to expect from that segment. In our case, the CTX01 subposition 1 is CLM01. Those of you familiar with an 837 will know that a CLM01 is the spot for a patient account number or some kind of identifier assigned by the provider or whoever it is creating the claim. Now, if I also know that the CTX01 subposition 2 is for the value from the original submission, well, in my example, I know that 2Smith002 was in the CLM01 position on my original claim. So, in this particular case, this is what would identify the error as having been on the claim level. This was probably not a batch rejection. I can probably just go to the file that had a CLM01 of 2Smith002 and just fix and resubmit that one. After the CTX, we get IK4. Now we're getting into the data element level. It is situational, so you won't always get it. But if the error applies at the data element level, then you might get this segment. If you do, the first one, the first position, is going to be which data element was an error. Now my segment was DTP. Now I know from here that it was the DTP03 position. Next up is a reference number in the data element dictionary. Now, the data element dictionary can be kind of an elusive document. If you have a copy, you can look it up in there. If not, I wouldn't worry about it too much because there's plenty of information in these other elements to make up for that lack. So we're going to pretend in our example that we don't have it. We're just going to skip right on. Look at that. We get another syntax error code. Again, it's just going to be giving us additional information about what happened. The fourth position is a copy of the bad data, and this is also situational, so you may or may not get it, but when it is there, it's awfully nice to be able to see that, oh, you know, in my case, you know, it was a date. This particular date, for some reason, was the problem. And then lastly, after that IK4, I get another CTX. This one is, again, segment context. It is also situational. But again, I'm going to focus on the first position to tell me what this one's all about. And that context identification says situational trigger. So I know that this particular CTX is telling me that the error was situational in nature. Now, the rest of this is going to be some form of identifying the area that triggered the situational rule. So if I look at the CTX02, I see the segment code. Okay, so another DTP segment was the reason for this rule coming into play. Next is the segment position. This is the count. So this is going back to counting from the ST. And the other one was 22. This one's 26. So I know it's a different DTP segment that caused the other one to kind of show up as a problem. I do have a blank space in this particular area, but just so you know, if you do get something in the fourth position, it would be the loop identifier. Fifth position is the position in segment, so now I know it's, again, DTP03, so it's another date. And the last one is a reference in segment. This is, again, referring to the data element dictionary. Again, if you don't have it, don't worry too much. In fact, that one doesn't always show up, so we'll just focus on the rest of it for now. Okay, so this is one more look at the big picture. We've got our header and footer. We've got functional group with both header and footer, transaction set response with header and footer, and then we've got the error information inside. Now, we're going to take a look at some examples, and I'm going to give you a couple of goals. Your first goal will be to identify the status. So try and figure out if the 999 is accepted or rejected. Next, identify the original transaction. So this means look for the headers, the AK1, the AK2. Look for if it was a claim level rejection. So you might be looking for that CTX with the business unit identifier. And then after that, once you've identified which original transaction is involved, see if you can identify the areas that will tell you the location of the error and the reason for the error. Now, you don't have to be able to interpret it. I know not all of you are going to have implementation guides handy to look this up. So just try and find the locations where that information resides. We're going to do the first one together. So first up, there's my goals here off to the side. I'm looking for the status. So because it's a footer, I'm going to be looking near the bottom, and I see the IK5 and the AK9 about 3/4 of the way down. Both of them say R, so I know this is a rejection. And if I look at the AK9, I can tell that one transaction set was included and one was received, 0 accepted. Okay, so now I'm looking for the original transaction. I've got 3 things I can look for here. I've got the AK1 and the AK2, so I've got both a functional group and a transaction set response indicating a tracking or control number. And this one is a claim level rejection, most likely. So I've got a CTX segment with a CLM01. Now, for the error information, I'm going to be looking in the IK3 and the IK4 for that one. In the IK3, I see it's segment HI, segment count 22, so it's 22 segments down from the ST. Loop is 2300, syntax error code is 8. In the IK4, I can see it's position 1, subposition 2. So just keep in mind, if there's either a colon or a caret or a greater than, lesser than sign, if there's some kind of character separating some numbers there, you've probably got a subposition. Then we've got our data element dictionary number, which I'm going to skip past for the moment. The 7 is a syntax error code, and the example of the bad data is F431. So if I were to kind of summarize what I know about this, I could say that patient Smith, which is from that CTX segment, in batch 111824444 had an invalid value of F431 in the 2300 loop, HI01 subposition 2. Now, if I had implementation guides and I could take a look at that and see what the HI segment is, I would see that the HI01 subposition 2 is for the diagnosis code. And so I could look it up and find that F431 is an invalid diagnosis code. It's not good for billing purposes. Next example. For this one, I'm going to have you try and find each section before I give the answer. So I'll give you about 5 or 10 seconds lead time. Go ahead and try and find the status. And in about 5 or 10 seconds, I'll highlight it. Okay, hopefully you're looking about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way down and finding the IK5 and the AK9. After that, go ahead and try to find the original transaction. You're looking for the functional group and transaction set response headers and any CTX segments. Okay, hopefully you're looking right about here. We do have control numbers for both the GS and the ST from the original transaction. We do not have a CTX segment with a CLM01, so this is probably a batch level rejection. I would anticipate the entire batch in that GS control number, that whole thing's going to need to be resubmitted. Okay, let's go ahead and try and find the error. See what you can make of that over the next 10 seconds. Okay, so coming in, we're focusing in on the IK3 and the IK4. If we look at that, main areas of interest, I see that it's a 2010 loop, segment N4. Segment count is only 9, so I know this is pretty far up on the transaction. It's probably going to be in the area where we're just kind of identifying who's who. In the IK4, I can see, besides the position, I'm really focusing on the IK404. The bad data is 84102. So here's our summary if we were to put that all together. Batch 2315648 had an invalid value of 84102 in the 2010 loop N403. If I were to, again, look this up and compare in the original transaction, I would find that this particular N4 segment is for the billing provider address. And billing provider zip codes must be 9 digits. This one was only 5, so it would have failed. For the third example, I'm going to give you guys about 30 to 45 seconds. Try to identify as much about all three of those goals as you can, and then we'll go through the answer together, starting now. Let's start wrapping it up. And let's take a look and see how far you got. I'm going to highlight everything all at once. So for the status, we've got a rejection in the IK5 and the AK9. Original transaction, we've got an AK1 and an AK2. Although we have a CTX, it is not a CTX with a CLM01, so this would also be a batch level rejection. Now, when it comes to the error information, we've got the IK3, the IK4. The IK4 does not have a fourth position, so we don't get a copy of the bad data element, but we do have a CTX with a situational trigger context. So if we kind of put this all together, we can see it's an SV1 or service line segment, 24, so it's a little further down, 2400 loop. That makes sense. That's pretty much the only place you'll get an SV1. In the IK401, we see it's the SV101 subposition 7. In the CTX, we'll see it's the same segment because we've got the same SV1. It's the same segment count, but the position is SV101 subposition 2. So subposition 2 triggered the need for something in SV101 subposition 7 that wasn't fulfilled, thus the error. So here's our summary here. Batch 27666 had a situational error involving the 2400 SV1017 and SV1012 fields. Now, if we were to look that up and look at what is required for each of those, we would find that the SV101 subposition 2 was for the CPT code, and this particular CPT code needed a service line description in the SV101 subposition 7, and it did not have it. Thus, we didn't have an IK404 to look at, and thus the error. Okay, so that was the 999. Let's swap gears and move into the 277. This is the business rules acknowledgement. And let's go again left to right. We'll start at the purpose. We'll see it reports the business rule errors for the functional group. So again, anything between the GS to GE, that's fair game for the 277. Business rule errors. Those are stuff like, do the identities match what the receiver has on file? Does the subscriber have coverage? Do any of the services need prior authorization? These sorts of things tend to fall into the business rules acknowledgement. In the characteristics, you'll see this is typically going to come back within 48 hours. And this one is much more common than the 999. So even if you don't get a 999, you probably will get a 277. Now, when they do come back, 48 hours is again kind of the longer end of that time range. I usually see them within a matter of hours. The 277 also typically goes into claim level details. Now, there are exceptions to that, and I'll show you what they look like. But most of the time, we can expect something at the claim level for this. And then on the right there, once more, I just have the version in case you want to check it on the GS segment or in case you need to purchase an implementation guide. And again, these slides will be sent to you. So if you don't write it down super quick, not a problem. You can just reference it later. Here's the hierarchy of a 277. It's just a little more complicated than the 999. Still, I'm showing you all of the hierarchy that falls inside of the transaction header and footer stuff. So this is inside the ST to SE. And we've got 4 main levels. We've got information source, information receiver, billing provider, and patient. Now, I've got the level numbers off here to the right, and you'll see here they all begin with 2000. It's really going to be the letter at the end that will differentiate which one is which. Inside of the patient level, we have 2 loops that are important enough that I wanted to call them out. They are going to be, some of them are situational, just kind of depends on how the the file is created and what kinds of errors might be present. But just so you know, claim status information does come above service line information. Again, we're going to go from general up at the top to more specific the further down and in we go. So just like with the 999, let's take a look at that in the context of an example. Now I've taken away the header and the footer information from the whole transaction so that we can blow this up and make it as large as possible. You may need to expand your screen to get a really good view of it. But as you can see, this one's pretty simple. We've just got sections A, B, C, D, and they just go down from top to bottom. Now we're going to cover these section by section. So let's take a look at the information source. Now the first thing I want to point out here is that all of this stuff on the screen is part of the same level. So this is where we start getting into that hierarchical level stuff that I introduced at the very beginning of this webinar. The hierarchical level begins with this first loop, this 2000A, which is an HL segment. The HL stands for hierarchical level. So when you're looking at raw data and you need to find where a level begins, look for the HL segment. And they're all numbered, so you can tell how many levels there are in a transaction. This is the first level, as we can see from the number after the HL. After we have an HL segment defining the beginning of the level, we get an NM1 segment. This is going to identify the entity in this particular level. Since this is all about information source, the entity is the source. In our case, it's Cigna. After that, we get what I would consider to be the payload of this level. This is going to start with a TRN segment, which is a transmission receipt control ID. At this particular level, that's what the TRN does. It's a sort of receipt ID. It just says, we got it. So you get at least that much. Underneath that, we have two DTP segments. These are the receipt date and the process date. So if you ever need to compare those and see if there's a discrepancy, that's the place to go. You're going to want to go to this 2000A level. After the 2000A, we get the 2000B for information receiver. And this one, again, it's the same structure, actually. We start with the HL segment, and then after that, we get the NM1 segment that's identifying the entity. And then, I had gotten there a little bit early, but we get a payload section that starts with a TRN. Again, we get some kind of control number. In this case, it's the transmission receiver application trace number. So it's a receiver level number so that you can use to say at the receiver level, we can confirm this much. Underneath that, we've got this STC thing here. This STC segment is receiver status information. STC segments are going to be very important. So on the next slide, I'm going to call that out and go into it in a bit more detail. So we'll come back to this one. After that, we get two quantity segments here. Now, when it says accepted quantity and rejected quantity, this is actually talking about number of claims, not dollars. The next two segments about amounts, those are about dollars. This is the accepted and rejected dollar amounts for the 277. Okay, so let's jump into that STC or status code section. STC segments are going to be giving you the accept or reject status for a 277. The main portion of this to pay attention to is actually going to be the first position with its 3 subpositions. Within that, you're going to get pretty much everything you need. The first subposition is a category code. And gosh, it looks like the letters just got all funky when I brought it up on this computer. My apologies. Okay, so the category code is going to tell me was it accepted, was it rejected. The A happens to mean that it was acknowledged. And in fact, there's a couple other letters that they could use. If it started with a P, I would know it was pending. If it started with an E, I would know it was an error. A, though, is by far the most common one that you're going to see. So for the most part, you're going to just need to know A is acknowledgement, and the number that follows will tell you the rest. Anything between A0 and A2 is some form of acknowledgement and acceptance. The file is going to continue processing. Just as a side note, there are some software systems that think that A0 is a rejection. It's actually not. It indicates that the claim is being forwarded to another entity. So if you get that, just let them know, and A0 is still an acceptance because the file is continuing to process. If you get anything, though, that's between an A3 and an A8, these are different forms of acknowledgments and a rejection. So they are acknowledging that they had the file, that they got it, but they're also kicking it out. They're not going to be processing it further. After that, we get the status code. And the status code is going to give us additional information about why it was accepted, rejected, etc. Now, there's a whole long list of these. I'm going to show you a link later that will take you to this particular website, but just suffice to say, it's far too many to make it worth it to try and memorize them. So I would recommend, if you don't have one already, use one of the websites I'm going to be giving you later, bookmark it, and use that anytime you need to look up a status code. The third subposition is an entity code, and you may or may not get this depending on the status code. But if the status has something to do with an entity that would need to be further identified, like did this apply to the subscriber or to the dependent? Was it the billing provider, the rendering provider, the referring provider? If you need to make those kinds of distinctions, the entity code is how that's going to happen. In the STC02, we have a date. And then the STC03 is actually another accept-reject code. It doesn't get into as much detail as the category code that we saw earlier. It's just going to say accept or reject, essentially. And then the last position there is the dollar amount affected by this STC segment. So STC segments, just keep in mind that it's that first position that's going to be super important. If you have to memorize anything, memorize what that first position entails. The first subposition is the category, next is the status code, next is entity. Now, why might someone report a status at this level? And especially, when might someone reject something at this level? The key is when the status is going to include an entire unit of work. And the best example I have of that is a duplicate file. So if the entire file was a duplicate, there's not a heck of a lot of reason to go into detail beyond this. In the example that I saw, the file actually pretty much ended here. After the 2000B level, it just wrapped up with the transaction footers and just called it a day. So they never got to the claim level information. If you see a 277 like this, if it's something that affects the entire unit of work, this is actually a valid use, and in fact, in many ways, it's the intended use for the transaction. If you need to identify this, your best bet is to go to the TRN segment in either of the first two levels, either the information source TRN, which will be the source kind of receipt, or the information receiver TRN, which will be at the receiver level. So that's going to be your best bet in those cases. Moving on to the billing provider. This again starts with an HL segment, and then we'll move on to the NM1, which is going to identify the entity, in this case, the billing provider. And then we get to the payload. So again, same structure. The TRN in this case is the provider of service trace identifier. So this is at the provider level. After that, we get a ref segment, billing provider status information. And by the way, it's hard to tell right now because I've got an example up, but this was actually the fake tax ID from the original file. After that, I again get quantity for, again, quantity of claims, not quantity of dollars. I do get quantity of dollars in the AMT segments that show up there. And I apologize for things being offset. Somehow when I opened up the presentation on a different computer, it messed with the margins on things. Okay, so you may have noticed that there's no STC segment in this one, like there was on the previous one. Well, there's actually a lot of wiggle room for how these things are put together. STC segments can be included on some of these levels if they're relevant, or they can be left off if they're not relevant. In this particular example, the person or the company that generated the 277 felt there was no real point in putting an STC on this level. But if there was one included, it would be structured just like the last one underneath the TRN. Now, when would someone include an STC at the billing provider level, and especially when would someone reject for it? Well, it really depends on whether it is related to a specific billing provider's entire group of claims. My example for this one is when there's a missing or invalid tax ID. Again, if you think about it, it's going to affect everything by that billing provider if the tax ID is off. So this one would make sense. And again, if they reject here, it is possible that they would just finish at this level, wrap up with the footers, the SE, and all of those things to just finish out the transaction and call it a day. The last level is the patient detail. And this one, again, we start with an HL. We move to an NM1 that identifies the patient in this case, since that's the entity for this loop. And then we get into a TRN as part of the payload. This TRN is the claim status tracking number. Then we do have an STC segment on this one. This is the claim level status. And then we have a payer claim control number. Now you may be wondering, why do we have a payer claim control number and also a control number at that TRN segment? The difference is that the TRN control number is actually from the CLM01 position in the original claim. So it's going to be something that's going to make it easy to refer back to the provider system. The ref number, on the other hand, was assigned by the payer to identify it in the payer system. So if you're on the phone with the payer and you're trying to identify this, it's probably a better use to use the number from the ref segment, because that's the one that their system will recognize for sure. After that, we get a DTP segment with the claim level service date. Now, in the very beginning, when I was showing the layers, there was also service line information. That is an optional segment or a situational one, depending on whether if there was an error, assuming there was, if the error had anything to do with the service line. If there is, it's going to appear down here, just underneath the claim level, and it will be structured very, very similarly. The difference is that instead of starting with a TRN with a claim level identifier for the patient, it's going to start with an SVC segment that's going to repeat the details billed on that service line. So it's going to identify the service line. The rest of it will be the same. You'll get an STC segment to identify the status on the service line. You'll get a ref segment with an ID, a control number that's for that service line. And you'll get a DTP with the date from that service line. So when are statuses reported at the patient detail level? Well, this one, actually, if they report the patient detail level at all, then it's required to have the STC segment here. So what's ended up happening is that this has become the catch-all for many, many different types of errors. So by far, it's the most common one. Now, if you look on the left column there, you might see some stuff that says billing provider. You might be wondering, why is something that's indicating the billing provider being reported at the patient detail level? Well, there's actually just some variation in how different information sources have implemented this transaction. There are some payers that will have a billing provider tax ID error reported at the billing provider level, and there are other payers who will have the exact same error reported at the patient detail level. So it just depends on who's creating the 277 and how they've got it coded in their system. So just so you know, there can be a little bit of variation there. Let's take a look at some examples, and I'm going to give you some goals here. The first goal is to identify the source in the 2000A level. Now, when I say identify the source, I mean the name of the source. So you're going to need to go to the NM1 segment in that level. Next, we're going to try to identify the receiver, and this is, again, the name of the receiver. We'll identify the billing provider, and we'll identify the patient. So basically, we're looking for the NM1 segment in each of the levels. Now, if you're up for it, there is a bonus or stretch goal, which is to identify the status. So, by the way, when you're looking at that, because there can be multiple STC segments in the file, usually the one furthest down, which will again be the most detailed area, that's going to be the one with all the juicy stuff. So I usually recommend go from bottom to top, use the STC segment that's at the bottom first, and then just scan the rest of the file and see if there's anything else worth looking at in the other STCs. So here's your example. Again, if you haven't expanded your screen yet, you may want to now so you can see it. And I've got your goals here on the side. So we're going to take about a minute for this, and then we'll see what you got. So starting now. Okay, let's start wrapping it up. Let's take a look at what you got. As far as the source goes, I'm looking under the first HL segment, and so hopefully everybody saw that this Public Employees Health Program in this case was the information source. After that, under the second HL, I can see that the receiver was generic family practice. The billing provider was again generic family practice. And the patient was first last, which is a very inventive patient name, I'm sure. Now, if you got as far as identifying the status, hopefully you were looking from the bottom up and you found the bottommost STC right there. And if you remembered, anything between A0 and A2 was an acceptance, so in this case, the 277 was great. Let's look at another example, and I'm going to give you slightly different goals this time. The first goal is to look at the receive and process dates in the 2000A level. So you're looking for receive and process dates. That's your hint. Now we're going to skip the next level altogether and go straight to the 2000C, the billing provider level, for accepted and rejected amounts. This is going to be the dollar amounts. Third, we're going to find the payer claim control number. This is the one that is generated by the payer for their own system. And then we're going to find the claim level status. So this is the STC in the claim or patient detail level. The bonus or stretch goal on this one is to find the date of service in that 2000D level. So here you go. We're going to take about another minute, and I've got your goals here on the left. Okay, we'll start wrapping things up. Okay, so looking at the 2000A level, I'm looking for receive and process dates. Well, I know it's under the first HL, so if I look between the first and the second HL segments, there are only two segments that have anything to do with dates, and they are right here, DTP. The 2000C accepted and rejected amounts. So I know that's going to be after the third HL. So I'm going to look in between the third and the fourth one. That's just kind of my general zone. And I'm looking for the AMT segments right here. The payer claim control number. Now this is the one, this was a little bit of a trick question or a curveball, but it is the ref segment, not the TRN. So remember, the ref segment is the one that has the payer assigned number. The TRN is the number from the provider system, from the CLM01 from the original file. The claim status is actually just above the ref segment. In this case, it was an A7, so this was extra credit, but if you remembered, A3 to A8 is a rejection, so this one did get rejected. And the bonus, the date of service, was actually at the very bottom. It was the last line. In this case, 2018, February 27th. Now, you might have noticed through all of this that these transactions rely very heavily on referencing external code lists. There are just too many codes to try and memorize, so it's very important to have good resources so you can go and figure things out by looking things up. So the X12 code list I've got on that first bullet, these are going to show you the claim status category codes from the 277. This is the stuff in the STC01 subposition 1, like A0 through A2 and A3 through A8. You can also get the claim status category codes, the claim status codes, and the claim status codes are going to be in the STC01 subposition 2. This is the one that gives you more detail where I said there's too many to try and memorize them. This is a free place to look it up. It's on the WPC or Washington Publishing Company website. Please do go look them up. Now, underneath that, the First Coast 277CA lookup, this one is very similar in the sense that you can look up those same category and status codes from the 277. This one will also show you entity codes from the STC01 subposition 3. So if you need those, maybe try this First Coast lookup. The implementation guides are available on the X12 store, and if you don't have them, you can probably see now, just especially on some of these transactions, how much difference it can make to reference the information in there, especially for trying to look at syntax error codes and things like that that are created and maintained by X12. This is the only place you'll find them. Now, there are going to be code lists inside these particular transactions and inside the implementation guides that are not owned and maintained by X12, and so they'll just reference you to the external site wherever they are maintained. And so examples of that are going to be zip codes and ICD-10 codes, also CPT, things like that. At this point, I would like to open this up for questions. We have a couple minutes left. Go ahead and use your chat function. Move your mouse to the center and bottom of your screen, type your questions in, and we'll see what we can get answered.
All right, thank you very much, sir, for that very informative webinar. We do have a question, and that question is how to connect the 999 and 277CA with 837 files. What are the common segments in both 277CA and 837s?
Thank you. That is a good question. Now, the easy scenario is when the 277 goes down into the patient level detail. If it gets to that level, then you're going to get claim level, patient level stuff. In those cases, I would use the TRN segment from that level. If it doesn't get to that level, it does get more tricky. At that point, it might mean a call to the payer and referencing the IDs from the other TRN segments that you do have and having them look it up and identify the information from there. When it comes to the 999, I usually go based off of the AK1. Now remember, there's both the AK1 and the AK2 for the GS and the ST from the original file. However, since the since the GS and the ST usually both have the same status down in the footer, if both are rejected, well, at that point, I might as well just go based off of the GS level or the functional group level ID because I know everything within that will be rejected too. So in those cases, you're just going to have to do a search based off of that AK102 position and link it back to the original file from there. Of course, if it is a claim level rejection and they have that CTX segment, definitely go with that. That'll narrow it down a lot faster.
Again, if you have another question, please put it into the chat box and we'll be happy to answer that for you. All right, seeing no other questions, we're going to go ahead and turn off the recording. However, we will be available to answer any questions if they come to you in the meantime. Again, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and we look forward to you joining us on our next webinar in September on LACE. Thank you very much, and have a great day.